You are listening to Based in Fact, a true crime podcast. Join host Lisa O'Brien and Kyle Evans as they examine America's most infamous true crime cases as they were established in our courts and the basis for the decisions of the appeals courts, not the court of public opinion. Here's Lisa and Kyle.
Welcome to Season 3 of Based in Fact, a true crime podcast. We're your hosts, Lisa O'Brien and Kyle Evans, and this is Episode 9, The Failure of Bail Reform. We're joined today by Ken W. Good, a member of the Board of Directors, Professional Bondsmen of Texas. Mr. Good holds a Bachelor of Arts from Hardin-Simmons University, a Master of Education from Tarleton State University, part of the Texas A&M system, and earned his JD from Texas Tech School of Law in 1989. He was also a member of the Texas Tech Law Review. Mr. Good has argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and numerous courts of appeal, including the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. Mr. Good is married and has 2 daughters. In addition to hosting the Bail Post podcast, he's the author of Goods on Bail, a practice guide for bail industry professionals. Yes.
I lost you.
Oh,
yeah, we think you cut out for a second.
Oh, I don't know why. I need to stop Zoom because Zoom is unstable. All right. We're just gonna pivot and introduction over. Welcome, Mr. Good. If you'd like to finish with your credentials and some of the articles you've written and books you've written, that would be great.
Oh, I would just say it looks like I've been an attorney forever, and it feels like it sometimes. But I would say probably most important of anything is I'm also married to another attorney, and she and I have 2 children together, both girls. And my oldest is out of college working and on her own, and my youngest just finished her first year of college, so she just finished freshman year.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
I
Feel
have
like
no
I'm on the home
children.
stretch. Yeah. Well, my youngest had a bone marrow transplant when she was 5. And so when people say, oh, this is going to be tough, I'm like, there's nothing tougher than a bone marrow transplant.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that she's doing well.
Yes, she's doing very well.
And good afternoon, Kyle.
Good afternoon. How is everyone today?
Very well.
Great to meet you, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right. So, let me first start off with what is the difference? Some cases or some places you have what's called personal recognizance, and then you have a bail bond company. So what are the differences between those or distinctions between those 2 systems for bail and release pretrial?
Well, okay. So at the state level, each of our 50 states regulates how, we release people pretrial. And so in Texas, we have 3 types of things that can be posted to get somebody released. One is a surety bond, which is the private sector. It's the only one that has a constitutional protection. It's the only one set out in the Texas Constitution. Then we have cash bonds, and then we have personal bonds. Some people call them personal recognizance bonds, but in Texas, we call them personal bonds. Now, personal bonds is an example of simple release. So they're just giving their promise. They're not really paying anything. They're not really giving anything. And what is a simple release? What we call it varies between states. So in New York, it would be called released on no bail. California, it would be called released on 0 bail. And then there's some other types of releases that Texas does not recognize that some other states do. I think probably the best example would be Illinois. They just got rid of cash bail, but it really, they made it sound like they got rid of the surety bail, but they'd already done that years ago, and that's the reason why crime was increasing. But what they got rid of just recently was either cash bonds or the ability to pay a percentage to the courts, which Texas does not recognize. And so the courts were getting funded in part through people's failures to appear. And so they got rid of that, but they didn't replace the funding, and crime is increasing even more, and the courts can't handle it because they've lost funding for a large part of, or some of their operations. So there may be some other types of release in other parts of the country, but I think that's a summary of the different types.
That sounds accurate to me. Thank you. And then also, I wanted to focus on, what do you perceive to be the misrepresentations made by the reformers about the bail system, what it means, what its purpose is, in their efforts to change the criminal justice system and pretrial release?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So I would say my first criticism is I think the bail industry is the low-hanging fruit. It's there's a reason why it's been around 200 years. It does one thing, it does it really well, but it's not like anybody likes us a whole bunch. But the problem is the misrepresentation that's being made or was being made with effect, and you're now seeing states pull back and start to undo reforms, is this concept that there are alternatives. It started out with, well, we've got to come up with something new because bail is going to be held unconstitutional. Well, the 11th Circuit and the 5th Circuit have now held bail constitutional. So that wasn't a valid argument. So now we've heard, then it switched to, oh, well, we've got to do something because this isn't fair. We need to be fair. But, I heard a mayor who was a former judge in a News Nation town hall, and I think she probably said it best. Until you have an alternative to the private industry that has the same low failure to appear and the same high accountability, then you don't have an alternative. So when the private industry has a failure to appear rate of less than 10%, that means 90% of the people show up when they're required to show up day in and day out. And then you start doing these alternatives that have been tried, and you start doing or taking away the private industry and just doing the alternatives. And when the alternatives have a 50% failure to appear rate or 60%, or like misdemeanor courts in Harris County, which is Houston, 80% failure to appear rate, which you just think is a shock until you realize that I did an interview with a DA in Yolo County, California. He said, we do the same thing that Harris County does in all of our misdemeanor courts across this state, and we have an 80% failure to appear rate there as well.
Wow.
And so you can see what an 80% failure to appear rate does. It creates big backlogs. It creates chaos. It creates a push for the courts to dismiss cases to prevent the system from collapsing. And that's exactly what's happening on our low-level crimes. And the reason why the jails are filling up in those areas is because the low-level crimes become the training grounds for future felony offenders.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think also something in a lot of the articles, your articles, as well as some of the others I read, is not holding people accountable for failure to appear is part of the problem as well, because they don't suffer any consequence of being put into being held pending trial or anything of that nature.
When, in our criminal justice system, cases can't go forward if the defendant's not there. I mean, there's very limited, very few situations, like if they show up after you've already impaneled a jury, you can try them in absentia. In Texas, maybe some other areas as well. But by and large, your case gets put on hold if you fail to appear. And so, if you have an 80% failure to appear rate on misdemeanor offenses, those 80% of those cases for that week are put on hold until you come back.
Mm-hmm.
And if you come back in an hour, great. If you come back in a week, great. But if you don't come back for a year, that case is on hold. And that's the reason why, accountability is so important in those situations. And where we're seeing these reforms, especially in our urban areas, I mean, when you see somebody who's been released on 17 different bonds and they keep failing to appear, then how long has that taken place? I mean, they just didn't miss 17 weeks in a row. I mean, they missed for a while, came back, got out again, missed for a while, then came back. I mean, without accountability, uh, I mean, there's nothing but chaos when you have simple release. And when you have chaos, you can't hold anybody accountable because you don't have room in the jails to hold I mean, the Harris County jail is full. They're sending people to other counties of people who are very, very dangerous. They don't have room in their jails to hold people accountable for low-level offenses or even a lot of felony offenses for their failure to appear. They're just completely resetting them because of how bad their jail population is right now.
Right. And I'm from New Orleans. We had a catch and release program as well, which was not successful, and we still have high crime rates.
Absolutely. Well, a catch and release has at least a 40% failure to appear rate. And if you imagine you get a citation to show up and 40% of the time you don't, well, then they have to decide whether they're going to go get you again or just dismiss the case.
And then usually they dismiss.
Over time, yes,
and that
because that's one thing they can do without you there.
Mm-hmm.
But they can't take action on it unless you're there.
What is that they can do? They can dismiss if you're not there?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. They can dismiss it without you, but they can't find you guilty without you.
And that was the solution in Harris County at one point, was dismissing 72% of misdemeanor cases.
No, I looked at a docket for August in 1 year. I think it was 2022, because they release a report of all the cases that were resolved in a month. And I reviewed 1 month in August, and over 90% of them for that month had been dismissed.
Okay. I'm thinking of an earlier, maybe like a 2020 article.
You're thinking of a report from the Police Officers Union, because
that's
the monitor of the O'Donnell settlement has issued reports periodically saying, oh, the failure to appear rate is low, it's like 20%, and we just said that's wrong. He can't even tell you the numbers. And so we the DA came out with a report saying, you know what, it's at least 50%. And then the Police Officers Union, after that, reviewed 1 week's docket for every misdemeanor court. And they came out with saying for that 1 week, it was at least 75%. And then HarrisCountyCourtWatch.com downloaded 2 years worth of docket from the misdemeanor, 2 years worth of data from the misdemeanor courts, and used the same formulas as the Police Officers Union, found a 2-year average of over 80% failure to appear rate.
That's scary.
It is scary. It is. And it's what happens when your criminal justice system is taken over by politics. That's really what it is in Harris County, because the O'Donnell case has been reversed. The Fifth Circuit has now said en banc that it should have never been filed. They're still following the settlement, even though it's been reversed in Harris County. In fact, they're on the docket or on the agenda for an upcoming commissioner's court is going to be a request for funds to train the judges on how to comply with the settlement, which has been reversed.
Oh gosh. But the Harris County government doesn't want to change things. They want to keep it the way it is because they're in the reform state of mind.
Well, they were the ones that, I mean, one of the commissioners invited the plaintiffs in that case to come to Harris County to sue the county. And then they used that. They spent $8 million defending the case. And, they and the paper was like adamant, oh, we need to settle. We spent $8 million defending the case. What they left out was and winning. And so it just happened at the next election, all the misdemeanor judges but one were up for election, and they all lost to people who promised to settle. And they all promised to give the plaintiffs everything they wanted. And now they've spent over $100 million to implement a settlement, which has been reversed. And the federal court says the case should have never been filed.
Yeah. So, and since we kind of reference O'Donnell, which is no longer good law anyway, what about Davies in Dallas versus Dallas County? That's a case that impacted Texas bail reform significantly, at least outside of Harris County, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, you have to start with O'Donnell, because O'Donnell sued Harris County and the misdemeanor judges, and Judge Rosenthal and O'Donnell held that the judges could be sued because they had set up a bail schedule. And so when they were setting up a standing order, they were acting as county policymakers instead of state actors. So under 42 USC 1983, state actors cannot be sued. So she made that ruling to get around that requirement and said they could. And so that was the ruling for misdemeanor judges. So when Davies was filed, Daves versus Dallas County was filed, they were seeking to do two things: have the O'Donnell ruling applied to the Dallas County misdemeanor judges, but also to extend it to the felony judges. So in O'Donnell, they didn't sue the felony judges, they only sued misdemeanors. So the Daves case was intending to extend that. And the reason why it was important is because at the trial court level, the judge agreed. He said there's really no difference between misdemeanor and district court judges, even though there is a substantial difference because county court judges are paid by the counties, district court judges are paid by the state. There's no question that district court judges are state actors, but the judge followed O'Donnell. And so when it initially went up to the Fifth Circuit, because, there's the panel decision, the en banc 1, en banc 2 decisions, initially, the panel said, well, we're bound by O'Donnell because initially the Fifth Circuit affirmed her ruling that the judges could be sued, but they had sent it back to her to redo the preliminary injunction. And so when it went to them on the Daves case, they said, well, we're bound by O'Donnell on the misdemeanors, but we will not extend it to the felony district court judges. We will not extend O'Donnell to the district court judges. And that's why, and they made a little comment in their opinion that said, if we had it to do over again, if we were considering the question on the misdemeanor judges anew, we don't know if we would have come to the same conclusion, which is appellate speak for if you want to have the court readdress or reconsider its ruling on the misdemeanor judges, you got to file something en banc because a panel can't reconsider that ruling. And so they filed a motion en banc. And so that's when we got to the ruling that reversed O'Donnell the first time, and then O'Donnell, the second opinion en banc when they went for the death knell and said it should have never been even filed in federal court, either Daves or O'Donnell. And so Daves was very important because they were trying to go for the death knell to extend the O'Donnell case from misdemeanor to felony judges and really tie the hands of judges across the state, saying you can't use discretion to deny somebody bail or to set high bail. You have to release them, and you have to release them on something they say they can afford, which is just ludicrous. If you make that ruling in Texas, then nobody can be held pretrial ever. Even if you think they're going to commit more crime, even if you think they're a danger to society, if they say they can't afford it, you have to release them. And you still have the reformers making those same arguments, even though we've had multiple federal courts saying you don't have a right to release. You have a right to a hearing to talk about release, but you don't have a right to release.
Correct. And, you've spoken in some of your articles or written about the impact of this zero bail and get out of jail free cards on criminals. Why don't you tell us about the two gentlemen who made the mistake of straying into Montgomery County to commit a crime?
Well, I think when you deal with cars is where you're really seeing in our inner cities. I mean, the damage that Soros and his have done to our criminal justice system is terrible, because once you get elected, it's a quid pro quo, and part of the quid pro quo is you'll no longer prosecute these crimes, and you'll no longer won't do enhancements. It's just ridiculous. And one of those is, like catalytic converter auto theft. And so in Harris County, they've kind of quit prosecuting those. And so you can imagine that those have skyrocketed, because a thief can make a couple $100 off a catalytic converter, but the middle person who buys it from can make thousands because of the precious metals in the catalytic converter. And so we have a couple, Larry and Mo, who are caught stealing catalytic converters, and they're in the police car and they're on the way to the jail, and they're like, wait, this isn't the way to the Harris County jail. And they're like, oh, you're not in Harris County. You wandered into Montgomery County. And in Montgomery County, we prosecute for these crimes. I mean, they've put up a big billboard on interstate. when you enter Montgomery County. Welcome to Montgomery County, where we support law enforcement and where we prosecute crime. Now, in that side, you have to have a sign that says that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
And
is
I
it fair
mean,
to say I've heard criticism of now with a lot of these new prosecutors, you basically don't have a prosecutor anymore. You have the actual defense attorneys and you have prosecutors that largely function as a defense attorney, meaning, such an overclubbing on, the defendant that basically there's not a prosecutor,
Absolutely. And I like to say there's nobody in the courtroom arguing for the victim. I mean, even Gascon out of LA, his office has, made the statement directly. Well, we just have a disagreement over who the real victim is. So what they're saying is the real victim is the criminal defendant who's been accused of the crime, not the person who had the alleged crime committed on them. And so you're right. You have the prosecutor arguing for the defendant, and you have the defense attorney arguing for the defendant, and there's nobody in the courtroom, no one, that's the voice of the victim.
yeah. And then also, you've addressed the some of the articles that I received were about the Safety Act in Illinois, which even though it's been expressed as being zero bail is meant misdemeanor and nonviolent crime, Safety Act actually makes certain what we would consider violent crimes eligible for no bail or zero bail.
Yeah, and that makes it sound like they don't get out, but no, yeah, they get released on zero bail. So they get released on just their promise. I mean, the Safety Act is it's
Nightmare.
a perfect example of when the act says the opposite of what it's doing. It's same thing for California when they were saying, the Safe Schools or something act, when they were, doing a proposition to change felonies to misdemeanors, but then they decided they weren't, in the inner cities, the Soros prosecutors said they weren't going to prosecute anymore, and that included theft under $950. But the Safety Act is anything about it's anything but about safety, because it is all about we've got to allegedly address these historic racial discrepancies and systemic racism in the jail. And the big irony on that is let's just take away the argument. Let's don't say it's right or wrong, but let's just say if they're wrong, then who are they hurting the most? The very people they say they're trying to help, because crime is usually committed by the same race as the accuser. So 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young black males. By and large, the murders are committed by young black males. So somewhere in this debate, we decided to favor the young black male murderer over the young black male victim. And I will say, there's a lot of data coming out now to show that they're absolutely incorrect about systemic racism, because we know that because they've done these things in the name of addressing it. And how many years later, the makeup of the jail is the same.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is exact. The percentages are the exact same. So either one, they were wrong in what they were doing and they won't admit it, or the whole time it was just a political agenda to try to gin up support. And the data is saying that's exactly what it is. We have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed on our minorities. And with these policies, they're ensuring that there will be even more disproportionate crime on our minority communities.
Yeah. And we also see, in New Orleans, we've seen a lot of retaliation, murders.
Yeah.
Someone commits
that's
a murder.
The vigilante justice. That's the vigilante justice period we're now going through, because the public will demand public safety. I'd probably disagree with the mayor of New York City on probably almost all issues, but he was on a podcast recently being attacked by the far left. And he said, one of the foundations of our society is public safety. And if we can't provide public safety, then we're not going to have a society. I would say even more, if the government will not provide public safety, the public will demand it, and they will get it in other ways. And what you're talking about is one of those ways.
Yeah. So,
I mean, we've
Well, it
gotten more
amazes me.
examples. We've gotten more examples of those in the last few weeks where, a mob just goes and grabs somebody that's been accused of something and beats the crap out of them because they know the police won't.
right. These have been in New Orleans. It's been,
Well, you were
gangbanger A
well, you were
gets,
talking about, racism, and I was blanking on it, trying to find it, but there was a an organization that did a study, did polling of people, and it's just amazing how much disinformation there is out
Mhm.
there, especially around, sort of police shootings. I think the actual number, I think is it the Washington Post that sort of keeps a running list, and on average there's about maybe 15 unarmed black men killed by police per year. And even in those cases, sometimes they still may be attacking the policeman, they just may not have a gun with them. But it was amazing seeing the attitudes kind of by political spectrum, and even folks that identified themselves as very conservative way over club the number to like 500 a
Mhm.
year.
Mhm.
And folks
Mhm.
that identified as very liberal, they thought it was, more than 10,000 a year. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
amazing the disinformation that, is out there, and people just don't understand the actual real world data, and they think at you know,
Well,
how
but I
some of
will
these
say,
problems are way over
well,
clubbed.
but I will say this: the advocates for change have done a really good job um, with elections. So if you really take a step back over the last 5 or 6 elections, 6 months before the election, there's an incident and it is highlighted, and we have marches on it. And what do you know? It's right before an election. And I would argue that, those weren't really about what was um, each event, but they were about the election because one party needed its supporters to get angry and then vote in anger, which would cause them to come out in larger numbers. We've now reached a point where, we've uh, those groups have created mobs and it's really hard to direct mobs. So the last election, we really didn't have one of those incidences. Well, no, we did before the last national election, but before the last midterm election, we didn't. And so I'm expecting this one. We're in that 4 month period. We're in a period where you would normally expect one, but they've lost so much control of the mobs that I think it would backfire on them if they did that again, because the mobs would just go crazy, because like they did, for George Floyd. So they've lost control over them, and so I think this will be the first national election without that, because they've lost control.
Well, and we might see it though, not to go down a rabbit hole, but I do think in some ways though we are seeing it, but we're seeing it with the anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli mobs that have really been
Mm.
fomenting and doing a lot of
Okay,
violence.
we are chasing a rabbit trail, but let me say on this, I have a strong opinion on that. That has everything to do about the state of Minnesota, and I mean, because it's one of those where anything you do as Biden hurts you. But he's chasing the state of Minnesota because if he can't win Minnesota, he can't win. And so there's a large enclave of Palestinian people or Arab descent people there. And, they were saying in primaries they were going to vote for none of the above. And they had, 100,000 people vote for none of the above on the Democratic primary. So it scared the crap out of him. And so I think what we're seeing is you're correct. It's the mob, but what's driving policy is the state of Minnesota and the fear. I mean, we used to have politicians that would do what they thought was right up to a certain point, and then what was good for them. I mean, maybe we never had that. Maybe I was Pollyanna, but it seems like with one side of the election right now, they don't care at all. Just get reelected no matter what.
I think
No,
that's what
that's 100%.
I think that's what the system is becoming. We can't have, if two people disagree, most of the time they can no longer have a well-reasoned debate because it turns personal or into mudslinging on both sides with
It's so true. And you see that on so many different issues. I mean, you know, back in the George Bush days of being president, you would give your opponents a half measure of what they wanted. So you would dampen their support. And so they would be milk toast when it came time for reelection. And so you would be stronger with your party. The problem is we don't have the resources to do that anymore because look at our deficit. And so you've got to pick who you're going to spend money on. And that's really what you're seeing. You're seeing, I mean, so many different things that we're talking about. You know, criminal justice reform is really about taking the money for those resources and moving them to other areas that are more in line with what the activists want that money spent on. And so that's when you take it, well, we're not going to prosecute these crimes anymore, or we're not going to, we're not going to arrest people for these crimes anymore, or we're going to defund the police. It's not, we're going to save that money. It's never about save that money. It's, we're going to move it and we're going to reprioritize it. So I think we're now at the point where any national election where we switch parties, the first year is going to be about undoing what the last president did. I mean, that's where we are. And the sad thing is, okay, everybody says, well, if it just wasn't Trump running, if it wasn't Trump running, we'd be leading huge. I promise you, no matter who was running on that side of the aisle, they would be treated no better at all because it worked. And so that's going to be the playbook from now on.
That's sad.
Yeah, it's really, really sad. I mean, you know, there's been periods and times in our past where it's been just as bad. So, I mean, I have hope. I keep saying we're repeating the cycles, you know, of the 60s. You know, in the 60s, we felt safe and we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. Crime started going up. We started having a debate of how to fix it. One side of the political class said, no, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to work with you. We don't think it's a real problem. And it kept getting worse and worse until Reagan was elected and we had the war on crime. And so I think we're repeating those mistakes, and it's going to get worse because the swing to the left was so hard and so fast because it was almost a coordinated attack. And so the swing back will be just as hard and just as bad. And so we have to defend against that, because the worst thing we can do is just say, we're going to hold everybody pretrial. We don't have the capacity to do that. Part of the reason why New York's in the shape it is because they've been limited on the number of people they can hold in their prison. And so everything in California is about reducing their jail population, not about reducing crime. They know they're increasing crime. Yeah, I did a podcast with somebody from New York saying they know what they're doing is increasing crime. They even admit it behind closed doors. They just don't care because they're getting their political agenda. And then I did a podcast with Kim Ogg, who's the current DA for Harris County. And she was originally supported by Soros, and then she was not. And then in the last primary, just a few months ago, she was defeated by a Soros funded, you know, up to $4 million in a primary. And she just lays it all out there. They know they're increasing crime. They just don't care.
Yeah. Now, what are the factors that are prior to the reforms? What were the factors that were considered by courts or magistrates in setting bond or pretrial release?
Okay, so in Texas, one of the factors would be your ability to pay. But the problem is, you know, they want that to be the only factor, your ability to pay, because they would argue you're innocent until proven guilty. And so you should not be held pretrial. You have a right to liberty. But the problem is all those arguments have been rejected by the courts. Pretrial release isn't about whether you're innocent or guilty. Pretrial release is what assurance you're going to give to the court that you're going to come back and answer these charges. And we know that if it's just a pinky promise that 80% of the time on misdemeanors, it's going to be, you're not going to show up. You gave a pinky promise. You didn't mean it. And so what the federal courts have said is their argument when it says your ability to pay has to be considered. They say yes, but it's only one of 5, 6, 7 factors. It's not the factor. And so your prior criminal history, it's your public safety, whether, you know, how bad was the crime that you committed, your criminal history. I mean, before SB 6, we didn't have a requirement that judges review criminal history before setting bail. We had some case law that said they had the discretion to do it. But SB 6, just 2 sessions ago, was the first time judges were required to review criminal history. And I think that's the biggest change in SB 6, because I think the biggest indicator of what you will do in the future is what you've done in the past.
Correct.
And
But-
we're told that we're racist for saying that.
No, that's reasonable. And it
Yes.
applies regardless of race. I mean, there are just as many Caucasian criminals probably sitting in Harris County with drugs and violence and domestic violence and things of that nature.
Well, okay. Go back to, do we have a disproportionate amount of crime in our Black and brown communities? If we do, then we have a disproportionate number of people in jail from our Black and brown communities, because by and large, crime is committed in the same neighborhoods and but on the same race. So if we have a disproportionate amount of minority crime in Harris County, then we're going to have a disproportionate amount of those same races in the jail. And that's true nationally too. I mean, there's a story for that. There's a reason why that is, but we don't have to get into that. All we have to say is there a disproportionate amount of crime on our Black and brown communities? Everybody says there is. Well, if you agree, then that explains why we have a disproportionate amount of those races in jail.
Yeah.
And if we're going to give them leniency and we're not going to prosecute them for crimes, then we have to understand that those crime in those neighborhoods will continue to go up, because they will see that as a green light to commit more crime.
Right. And it gets worse because, we've seen in domestic violence when the victim finally has enough and gets away and maybe gets a restraining order, 8 times out of 10, she's then murdered or he's then murdered.
Well,
because that just,
there's a really bad case.
Escalates.
There's a really bad case in Houston, specifically Caitlin Guajardo and her husband, Alex Guajardo, where he was already out on a personal bond for leaving the scene of an accident when she called the police and accused him of domestic violence, and he was arrested. Even though he was currently out on a personal bond, he was released again on a personal bond, and he went home and killed her within hours of his release. And I mean, he stabbed her 30-something times in her abdomen, and the reason why is because she was pregnant. And he told the investigator, "I don't want another man raising my child."
Yeah.
I mean, look, the domestic violence area is a really bad thing, a really bad area for the criminal justice system to begin with. Even before all these crazy reforms, I mean, we have a 50% dismissal rate on these allegations, on these types of crimes, and it's not because they're not valid. It's because there's the faith in the criminal justice system was already weak on domestic violence. I've talked to so many domestic violence groups since these reforms in our urban areas, and now they have no faith in the criminal justice system. They're going to, the criminal justice system is an afterthought. They have to plan their escape first. They have to plan their rehabilitation. What's their support system going to look like, and how are they going to survive first, and then worry about the court system. They don't have time to worry about that. They have to escape.
Right. And the system's not protecting them the way it should be.
No, it's not protecting them at all. I mean, when you've got police officers saying, my best advice to you is to run and get a gun on your way.
Yeah, and to circle back, I found it while we were talking, when I brought up a few minutes ago, if you search for Skeptic Magazine, How Informed Are Americans About Race and Policing, it provides some pretty interesting data around just how disinformed most people are about how big of a problem police violence against unarmed African Americans really is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've thought that for many years, but when we go, I mean, that's part of the systemic racism allegation, but how can we have systemic racism in our inner cities when the judge is the same minority, the prosecuting attorney is the same minority, the bailiff's the same minority, as the defendant, and the defense attorney is the same minority, the witnesses are the same minority. I mean, that argument has never made sense to me, and I've always thought it was a political argument, and it's part of this whole identity politics that we're still stuck in a little bit, where based on what your identity is, then you are disqualified. They're trying to make it so that, oh, you can never vote for me for running for anything because of your identity and my identity. I mean, just because I'm a white male, you shouldn't vote for me. And that's where we're having these problems. I mean, you think about what we've done in conjunction with that. The parties are not policing their candidates anymore. Biden is the perfect example. So nobody has stepped in, I mean, who got, what was his name? When the Republicans removed a president, and it was several times, it was right before, oh gosh, I've lost all track of names. But the Republicans went to him and said, you have to resign. Well, we don't have that anymore. We haven't had that since Clinton. The Democrats stood with him. They didn't like what he did, but he said, I'm not leaving, make me. And they didn't have the guts to do that. The same thing with Biden. So the parties are not policing their candidates. We've got rid of the filibuster. So we now are ruling from the extremes. We've gotten rid of the middle. And that's part of the problem. And we're going to continue to have that problem. And we're now seeing that bleed over into the states.
That was Richard Nixon.
Yes, I can't believe I can't remember that name. But I mean, when Nixon resigned, it was his own party that told him he had to resign. They're the ones that stood up to him. There's nobody on the Democrat side that will do that now. It just won't. And, the perfect example was, let's look at Texas. There was an impeachment of the attorney general by Republicans. The Republican-controlled House impeached him, and it went to trial in the Senate, which the Senate was never going to convict him, and they didn't. But then the attorney general went back and got candidates to run against all the people that voted to impeach him. And I would say probably half of them or more have been defeated.
Politics. We try to stay away from that usually, but for
Well,
this very reason.
Yeah, we have to. I mean, we have to find a way to take politics out of criminal justice reform.
Yes.
I mean, if we start with the proposition that there's nothing that has the appearance rate of the private sector, then we would require everyone to have a private surety bond, unless there was no other way we could get them out of jail. We're doing the opposite. We're getting rid of it. We're limiting the use of the private industry, and when there's no alternative. And the way they're fighting it right now is by disputing that crime is increasing. They're like, oh no, they're lying to you. It's just, crime is just has the perception that it's increasing. It's not really increasing. Believe us, don't believe them. And, there's more and more data coming out about that. I mean, on my podcast, we have people now from all these states coming out forward and saying they knew crime would increase. They just didn't care. And then when you have the NAACP from Oakland come out and publicly demand a state of emergency on crime, and then the DA, who's now in the process of a recall petition, said, oh, you're just sucking in the Republican talking points. Well, the regional NAACP came back and said, no, we agree with the local. Crime is incredibly bad. We need a state of emergency on crime. And they're just ignoring it. And they're trying to get through one more election and one more election and one more election. Eventually they will run out of elections because they can't even hide it themselves. They can't even deny it themselves that crime is increasing, because it is, especially in our urban.
Yeah, and I think you said it well. It was kind of like inflation. I think a lot of times they play this game where they say, well, it's decreasing. Well, okay, it might be decreasing from an all-time high. So maybe it's decreasing in the last 6 months, but if you go back to where it was, 10 years ago, it's way high. It feels like a lot of times between the inflation and the crime and kind of the lawlessness, feels like we're living in the, in the late 70s.
Well, they'll say, oh, crime's down 10%, 20% over the last year. And you're like, it's still up 40% since 2019. So Don't give me that crime is down. But you're exactly right. I mean, we're playing the numbers game, and you see that in so many different areas. We used to have a time in my lifetime where politicians were afraid to lie about those types of numbers, because, if the public thought you were a liar, then they wouldn't support you. We're past that. You started seeing that during Obama's term, I think, where he started playing fast and loose with some of the numbers about the economy, and had no criticism really, because the press is really quit criticizing that one side of the electorate, or of the two political parties. And so I think that will continue for a while. You saw that at the last election. You're seeing it now. Do we really have inflation? Oh no, we're not in a recession. I mean, if the other party was in office, they would be publicly saying been in a recession for a year. It's ridiculous. All honesty in politics is gone, and maybe that's an oxymoron to begin with.
And the media contributes and contributes and abets that kind of stuff, because we see that in criminal justice reform as well as criminal cases.
Well, and let's pull it across though. There is case law that shows us the way of what to do once you win. I mean, there's this Sanchez versus Alabama case where they lived under a preliminary injunction for 4 years, both as to misdemeanors and felonies, and they just had to let them out. And within 6 months to a year, the criminals realized, hey, they can't do anything to me, and crime started increasing. And I talked to the sheriff, and he's like, you know what? I'm just a Marine. I was an old Marine, so I didn't think this was right. So I wasn't giving in. And they went all the way to the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit reversed it and ruled for them, and the case was dismissed. And so I talked to the sheriff, and I said, how long did it take to right the ship, to correct what you're doing? And he said, well, we re-implemented a system of accountability, and if you didn't show up for your court date, there were consequences. And he said it took about 6 months, and crime started going down. So you look at that and you go, there's the model. Harris County can see what to do, but they don't want to do it. I mean, their jail is full. They're transporting people to Louisiana to be held in jail, and they won't change what they're doing because they can't admit they were wrong to spend over $100 million to implement something that they should have never implemented, because they were manipulating the public, that they should have never spent $8 million winning a lawsuit they were winning.
Right. To cutting off their noses to spite their faces.
Well, and probably what kind of graft are they
Sort of.
getting out of that 100 million?
Right.
That's where you are. I mean, there's so much money being spent, and there was some, allegations during COVID. They've got criminal charges pending against staff members of the commissioner's court. That was part of the election for the DA's office. We got people from the commissioner's court endorsing the opponent because he's agreed. The rumor is he agreed to dismiss charges against them if he won. And so it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's politics. I mean, that's what you see when politics gets into the criminal justice system. Everything is political. You only prosecute the crimes against your enemies. You don't prosecute crimes against anyone else. It's ridiculous.
Now, what are the criticisms of private bail bonding, bail bondsmen, insurance companies, things of that nature? What are the criticisms of those systems, which I think, if they have the low recidivism and low failure to appear rates, are the model?
Oh, they are the model. But the criticism is we're taking advantage of poor people, that poor people shouldn't have to pay to get out of jail, and that if we use that model, then the rich will always get out of jail, but the poor will be stuck there. And look, how many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, the bail industry was criticized for not being affordable. Now in Harris County, they're being criticized for being too affordable and not charging enough. And so they're setting up rules that require bondsmen to charge more than what they were alleged to be charging. Pick your argument. I mean, it's just like, in the middle of an election year, crime is going up. The use of the private industry is going down. They seem to be in conjunction to each other. And so what's the argument from the commissioner's court? It's the private bail industry's fault. Crime is increasing. That's when you know it's political. Because if the system is working the way it's supposed to be, you want as many people as possible to be on the private industry bail system, because you will get them to court. and you want it to be only the ones who otherwise would not get out of jail, first-time offenders, to give them a personal bond. But if you have a criminal history and you say you can't afford to get out of jail, you can't find anybody to work with you, then you're not there because you're poor. You're there because you have a criminal history.
Mm. And you're accused of yet another crime.
Yes, and you're accused of another crime. And there's limited situations where the magistrates can deny bail, but they can set it at amount. Okay, you say you can't afford that. Okay, well, they can set it at that amount. They have to consider your ability to pay, but it doesn't trump everything.
All right. Well, Kyle, do you have any additional questions or any additional topics?
No, I mean, I think it's been a really good discussion. I think I go back and just reiterate, I think what people forget is, as you mentioned earlier, Ken, but I thought it was a good point to go back to that, most crime is, single racial, most victims of crime by African Americans or other African Americans. And so at the end of the day, where I think people lose sight of and the narrative lose sight is, in most cases, the folks that pay for these kinds of policies are other African Americans or other minorities, and so, all of these is done under the guise of, quote unquote racism. And when reality, it's really the racism that a lot of these folks in power just don't care about, African Americans who suffer at the hands of these criminals. They just don't care about the victims of crime, especially when they're African Americans.
Well, you've also seen that when one race votes in block, you can see how they can get abused by that party. Because I would argue that this is all shows you how you can be abused by a party that takes you for granted. One of the reasons why you see people freaking out in the last couple of weeks at the national level is because there's starting to be a sizable shift in minority support for the Republican candidate for president. And even if it is still less than a majority, I mean, the Democrat Party really can't win at this point without a disproportionate percentage of people coming out. That's why of their supporters. That's why you see them trying to make people mad 6 months before the election, because that causes them to come out in larger numbers. What we're seeing is going to be anger all the way till November, because anger sells, and they've got to get that support to come home or they will lose. And so if the election was today, they would lose, and we'll see. There's a lot of things that are going to happen between now and then. But this is kind of the first election where I've been telling people, we're living in this identity politics world, but if you're voting on one side of the political spectrum, you need to be deciding just based on public safety, because they're ignoring your votes and they're doing whatever they want, except them, and they won't follow. They don't care about you on public safety. So until you get their attention, you need to vote on public safety only. And then once they decide, okay, yeah, public safety is important, and we get this ship righted, then we can go back to have our normal political fights.
Great closing argument. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great discussion, and we would love to have you back on other issues, other topics, any cases you're working on or any cases that you are involved in.
No, not any that are active right now. We usually have a list of cases that we follow, but we've finished them up recently, and so there's not any more exciting ones. I'm trying to think ones that are in the works even, but I'm not aware of any. But I'm sure more than happy to keep y'all in mind the next time one of these cases or one of these issues arises. We're at a point where these fights have moved to the legislature, and the left is having less success there. But at the same time, the fights continue. They make the same arguments every time, even when you say, well, they've lost that argument. Well, they lost that argument. The Fifth Circuit ruled against them. The 11th Circuit ruled against them. They never point that out. They just keep making them over and over and over. And they have all this money from donors, because they go to them and say, look, we won. We went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they just keep going. So I mean, if I hadn't started trying to get become knowledgeable in these issues, I don't know. We didn't know anyone else that was at the time, and we were so afraid of the rulings that were coming out in O'Donnell. It's so good to see that all that has been straightened out. The problem is that the damage from O'Donnell is still there. It's still lasting in Harris County, and it will continue because there were multiple courts across the country that cited O'Donnell in addressing bail reform, and they've not gone back and said, "Oh, well, O'Donnell was reversed, so we need to change our opinion."
Now,
So
one final question. Is the sheriff with Harris County, is that the same sheriff that was there for the O'Donnell settlement, or has a new one been elected, or when is the next election?
the next election is in November. But the current sheriff won the primary, and the current sheriff, he's a big problem because he's in bed with these reformers. I mean, he even filed an affidavit in the O'Donnell case saying, we need, the bail system's unconstitutional. And they've implemented a Rule 9, that allows him to just release people if they haven't seen a judge within so many hours. And so he's still there. He's a problem, but what he's done is he's gone underground. He's just gone completely silent on these issues. So you wouldn't know because he doesn't address these issues anymore.
Okay. So it would be probably take him being defeated by someone else to undo the harm that O'Donnell's done.
We need judges to start standing up and saying, O'Donnell's been reversed. We're not going to follow Rule 9 anymore. And we've started seeing a couple of elements of that. That's the reason why you see the Commissioner's Court wanting to hire somebody to train the judges on what they're supposed to do, because that means they're not being followed. Used to, they just threaten them. We're going to take you to the federal court if you don't. But because it's been reversed, that court doesn't even have jurisdiction anymore. So they know that's an empty threat. So now they're doing that. What we need is a couple of commissioners to be change parties or be voted out of office. And we need a new DA. The DA that won for the Democrats, and it'll be on the general election in December. Kim Ogg said if he wins, there will be a lot more crime in Harris County. Because if you're a Soros-supported DA, you'll go to a seminar where they'll say, here's what we expect of you. You no longer do drug enhancement. So if you're a drug dealer caught with 30 pounds of cocaine, they're only going to file possession of drug charges. They'll get you a week in jail at most, maybe 2, instead of 30 years because of the enhancements for the amount of drugs that were found with you. You won't do those anymore. You won't do enhancements for any other crimes either. You won't seek long sentences, and you won't prosecute minors as adults like you can if they're 16 or 17 and they're gang members. And so, gangs know who to go and commit or get to commit their crimes. They start do a recruiting drive because those are the people that won't be prosecuted. And the list just goes on and on and on of things you won't do on this quid pro quo. And that causes crime to increase because it's just, it's a revolving door on the jail.
Mm-hmm. And then they're not being held accountable and not going to prison like they probably should if they indeed committed the crime.
And then the whole COVID backlog thing has made it even worse. All the new judges that were elected, so because of the settlement or because of the fight over whether they should settle, and the new judges, and we're gradually taking out those judges a couple at a time. But it's just we've got a huge number of judges to still take on who are just they're scared too. They know what they're doing is wrong, but they've got somebody in the Commissioner's Court saying you will either do this or we'll put up with somebody to run against you at the next election. So what are you going to do? If you want to stay in office, you're going to continue playing the political game.
All right. Well, thank you again. This time we're going to let it go.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I promise I won't ask any more questions.
But again, it was great talking to you about the failure of bail reform. And we certainly please reach out to us if you have anything in the future that you'd like to come on and talk about, because it was an enlightening time.
Well, thank you very much.
And we appreciate your time.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
Nice to meet y'all.
Thank you for listening to Based in Fact, a true crime podcast with Lisa O'Brien and Kyle Evans. Thank you again to our guest, Ken W. Good. If you like the show and want to know more, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, find us on Facebook, or follow me on Twitter at O'Brien L. Ann. Kyle and I will return in 3 weeks for episode 10, State of California versus Phil Spector. Spector, who died in January 2021, was convicted of the 2003 murder of actress Lana Clarkson. We'll talk about the case against Spector, his trial, conviction, and direct appeal. Until then, have a great 3 weeks and stay safe.